Chapter 1. How we practice our art. Being on stage was an addiction. The roar of the crowd just fed and fed him, and James would never be full of it. He craved it. He loved the way all of the people were there for him, to see him and his best mates because they actually liked the art they were making. It connected with them. Their energy traveled up to him and struck him right in the heart every time, shocking him full of adrenaline and energy. They weren't just fans. Not really. Not to James. They were a part of his soul now, listening to the music he helped create. They all held a part of him, and he had a part of each of them. His fingers moved swiftly and deftly on the brand new electric guitar, and being surrounded by people chanting his name only inspired him more. It inspired him to give more, to be more. James shared a mic with Sirius for the last verse, the two of them singing closely. He could feel the way the energy was oozing off of Sirius, and it hit James harder than his own. It already did. As much as James felt the crowd, he always felt Sirius more. Their hearts beat in sync. Their minds pulsed as one. They were one. They were untouchable up on that stage. Their music would echo around the music hall for the rest of time, making them permanent, unforgettable, everlasting. They had just played the best show of their lives, and they were on top of the world, getting drunk backstage and waiting for the crowd to clear out. It was the biggest crowd they had played to yet, and it was overseas to where they were from, in a foreign country, foreign continent. James couldn't believe it. He was still vibrant from all of the adrenaline. That was fucking brilliant, Peter said as they ran off the stage. Only one drumstick since he had thrown the other one out into the crowd. They were told not to, but in the moment they were hardly thinking about their management. We've never played like that before, Sirius said, running his hands through his hair again. He was sweating, but he was glowing just like the rest of them were. He was the perfect frontman. Women loved him, he knew how to entertain the crowd, he knew what to say and where to say it. It just worked. James felt like his heart was going to fall out of his chest, and he was smiling wide. He didn't know it was possible to feel like this, like everything was perfect. He never wanted to stop feeling like this, and he understood how people got addicted to this lifestyle. It was their first night of the tour, and James was already dependent on that feeling. He was insatiable. He was addicted. They went out to a pub after. How could they not? It was the biggest night of their lives, and things were only going to get bigger from there. James could feel it. He could sense it. They were going to blow up in the best possible way, and he could not wait. New York had a lot of clubs, and for once they got it easily, able to bypass the line when one of the bouncers recognized them. He was never going to be used to it, being recognized. It was still such an insane thing to him when strangers knew his name and knew so much information about him. They knew his birthday, his parents' name, where he was born, all of this personal information with one quick search. It was loud, and it was crowded, and none of them minded one bit. James danced with Sirius, they danced with strangers, and they even got Remus onto the dance floor after he got them all another round of drinks. They stayed out for hours that night, not caring about the consequences or how hungover they were going to be next morning. They were on top of the world, and there was absolutely nothing that was going to bring them down. Their big break had been the song Sirius wrote, and he was being incredibly tight-lipped on who it was about, called You Get Me So High. It was that song that had gotten them a fan base, and then a record deal, and then an entire European and American tour that kicked off in New York City that night. They were on their way to being the new biggest band. Sirius came back to James's room with him for a little bit, and they listened to some of their songs, trying to relive the feeling they had felt on stage. They had performed before, but it had never been quite like that, where the whole crowd knew every word to songs that they had written. He had known Sirius since secondary school, and they had both wanted to make it big in music since as long as they could remember. He never imagined it could be a reality. James pinched himself every 2 hours at least to make sure he wasn't dreaming. The spot between his thumb and pointer finger was sore from how often he did so. His hotel room was a disaster after they had all gotten ready in there earlier. James has ended up getting the penthouse room, and they were all going to share before Peter said he wanted to bring a girl back. James wasn't sure if he ended up actually doing so. Things after the club were still a little bit fuzzy. Prongs, Sirius said again. They had just been going back and forth saying each other's name in a sort of awestruck state, eyes closed over from just how much they were feeling. They've performed before, but never like this. Never at such a large scale. Padfoot. Prongs. Padfoot. James Flemont Potter. Sirius Orion Black. It was electrifying, Sirius said after, basically erupting into his emotions, kicking his leg up as if he were trying to expel some of the energy. I want to do this forever. And Sirius really could do it forever too. He was bred for a life like this. A life where everyone knew his name. A life where everybody wanted a piece of him. A piece of star that was Sirius Black. You can, James promised him. And you'll do it with me? Of course I will. James continued to listen to music even after Sirius left. And he really felt like he got to be alone for a minute, to just exist and to think about everything that had happened today. They just played a show in New York City to over 1,000 people, and they were going to do that same thing all over the country. It was bloody. A very harsh and loud knock stopped his train of thoughts, and he had completely forgotten he was in hotel. Fuck, he said, turning his music down to a much more appropriate volume and making his way to the door. He hoped it wasn't management kicking him out or something. He had truly just forgotten that he was in a building with a bunch of other people. He opened the door, leaning against it for stability, and for a moment he thought it was serious and that maybe he had forgotten something. But the moment his eyes focused, he realized it wasn't serious at all, just someone who looked scarily like him. He had shorter hair, and his eyes were grayer than Sirius's bright blue ones. Plus, his feet seemed to be very beat up, which sent off a couple red flags in his brain. But for a moment, he swore it was his best friend looking back at him and not a stranger. Hi, James said first, since the man in front of him hadn't spoken yet. The second thing James noticed, after realizing that it was a stranger, was that he was a very beautiful stranger. James had always been a mess around beautiful people. He was alluring, and maybe it was just James being more than slightly drunk, but he wanted to know more. Turn the music down. Well, he did that already. Yes, it was after he had heard the knock, but the music was playing much quieter now. Aren't you going to say please? James asked. Selfishly, he didn't want him to go yet. Whoever it was hadn't recognized him, and nobody had ever been this harsh or cruel to him before. Not really. So, it was purely for self gain when he asked him if he liked the music, since James knew it was his, but the stranger didn't. He tried not to pout when he didn't get an answer, and instead went back into his room. He was too drunk to properly make music, but he was full of too much energy to not do something. He tried to play some things that he had already written on the guitar as quietly as he possibly could. Something in the back of his brain told him that if he played loud again, then the cute stranger would come back and yell at him some more. But he really didn't want to be rude. James's heart and soul was music. It had been since he was little and listening to his dad's Beatles records. He couldn't imagine doing anything else. Him and Remus wrote a lot of the songs for the band, and most of them were pretty good. Peter has been slowly starting to dabble in more songwriting, but he was still too shy to share any of it with them just yet. Sirius didn't write often, but when he did it big. Which is how James knew that the song Sirius wrote was important for one reason or another. It was about someone important enough to warrant a song written by Sirius Black. James let it go for now because obviously he didn't want to talk about it, but he couldn't help but be curious. Sirius hasn't really talked about any guys in a while, so it was hard to imagine who it was about. Their band had gotten together in a way that appeared seamless from the outside. They were just four lads who happened to be musically inclined, but really, it had been a lot of hard work on Sirius's part. James and Sirius had practiced the guitar until their fingers were bleeding and their hands were naturally calloused, until they could change chords with their eyes closed. They wrote song after song that would never see the light of day because they had been just teenagers. Their feelings had been surface level and cliche. Still, it was Sirius that had kept them motivated. He had gotten them small gigs at pubs in London, and slowly but surely those gigs became bigger and bigger. Sirius was their lead vocalist and rhythm guitarist. He was the frontman, even though they had long ago decided that they were a democracy. They still needed a face to show the masses, and Sirius had a very, very pretty face. He demanded attention, and he got attention. Plus, he had that little rasp in his voice that made the fans absolutely wild. He used that to his advantage whenever they were performing. Peter, to everyone's surprise, was a fantastic drummer. Him and Remus were the best at keeping time, but it ended up being Pete who blew everyone out of the water. On the outside, he had a much more mellow demeanor, but he was a beast when he was sat in front of a drum kit. They had songs they had written purely to give Peter more opportunities for drum solos. Remus was the bass player, and he sang, but only when he felt like it. Really, he had a heavenly smooth voice that drove everyone, including James, absolutely crazy. But he said he was fine leaving the singing to James and Sirius, and he never liked being in the spotlight that much. He shone anyway, whether he liked it or not. He had an almost haunting presence on stage. It was hard to tear eyes away from him. James was the lead guitarist and sometimes a vocalist. Really, Sirius sang the most, but every once in a while James or Remus took lead in a song. He had taken to guitar very quickly, and once he started learning, he couldn't stop. He also loved to write songs. It was a sort of therapy for him. The four of them had been together since school, although not always as a band. They were friends first, and they had absolutely adored causing trouble at school. Sirius held the record for most detentions given to a singular student, and he kept the title proudly. He once asked a favorite teacher to give him a plaque representing his accomplishment. On their graduation, she presented it to him, and now Sirius kept it on display in the flat they shared in London. Music originally wasn't all that serious, not for most of them. It was just something they did when they went over to James's house and were bored, messing around a little bit and occasionally sounding good. But it became more frequent, and soon they were just practicing. Like a real band, they were making music together, and they loved it. They would probably still be in James's house if it wasn't for Sirius. Had gone behind all of their backs that summer after graduation and signed them up at the Leaky Cauldron, a pub in London. Peter thought they weren't ready, that he was far from ready to play the drums in front of actual people. But it was a local pub, there was no real stakes in it. That gig became a regular one, and soon they were playing there every Friday night. James is glad that he gets to look back on those days fondly. Anyway, they had only broken up once, when Remus just sort of quit without giving them any sort of reason. It had been a miserable couple of months, and they tried to find a replacement bassist, but it just wasn't working and they had to stop altogether. James is pretty sure that Remus has still only told Sirius the real reason behind his absence, but he was back now, and he was happy, and that was what mattered. He didn't know how long he had been asleep, for when Sirius just waltzed into his hotel room, apparently scamming the lady at the front desk for a key to his room. "What time is it?" James asked, sitting up in the hotel bed. Sirius shook him awake, still shaking him even after James opened his eyes. He was generally a heavy sleeper, actually, but still. He had to sweat at Sirius to get him to step back. It was still pretty dark out, like maybe the sun was just starting to rise. His body was still partly on London time, and his natural clock felt very out of order. Sirius ignored his question, though, just slipping into the bed with him. "Bronx?" he said quietly. Usually, when he spoke like this, it meant something. It meant he was thinking. "Yeah, Pats?" he asked, a bit concerned. "My brother's in town." "What? In this town?" he asked. In the back of his mind, James remembered the stranger that had shown up at his door last night, although he thought it might have been a dream. A person like that could only ever exist in his dreams. Sirius turned his head to look at James like he was dumb. "What other town would I mean?" James turned over in the bed so he was facing Sirius, smiling at him through his sleepiness. "Spain, of course." "Spain isn't a town, and you are just saying that because you want to go there. So, is it wishful thinking that maybe if your brother happened to be in the town of Spain, not a town, then we could go visit?" "Right. Well, he isn't in Spain." James brought his mind back to the conversation they were having and not the literal dream destination. For a vacation, a wedding, a house. He simply did not know and did not care, just that he longed to go. "So, Regulus is in New York," James said slowly. Most conversation regarding Sirius's brother needed to be dealt with very carefully. Sometimes he would curse his name, other times he would sing his praises. Either way, James wasn't allowed to agree or disagree, so he found it best to just stay mostly silent. "Yeah, he is." "What for?" "Ballet." "He traveled all the way to New York to see a ballet?" James asked. He knew that blacks were rich, but from what Sirius had told him, Regulus didn't associate with them anymore. And London had a very good ballet itself, incredibly prestigious and posh, the kind of thing he was sure Sirius's brother would love. Sirius gave him that look again, the one where he definitely wondering if James was slow in the head. To be fair, he had just woken up after the very little sleep. He wasn't entirely sure of anything going on at the moment. "James, he's in the ballet." It rang a faint bell in James's head, like maybe Sirius had mentioned before that Regulus danced ballet, but again, he hardly spoke of his brother. or to his brother. James once tried to convince him to talk to Regulus more often, and he was treated with the silent treatment for over a week. Oh, yeah, right. Regulus, ballet, dance in New York. Got it, he said, catching up on everything to at least pretend like he understood what's going on. Truthfully, James was so confused. I think I have to go see him. Really? James asked. He couldn't help it. The words had just sort of tumbled out of their mouth. He literally had not seen his brother in years. And while they were slightly better at staying in touch over the phone, it was different in person. Sirius, at least, didn't seem to mind. He knew that James really didn't have a filter most of the time, and he navigated it better than most of the same way James navigated the same things about Sirius. Really, both of them just said the first thing that came to mind and didn't recognize the repercussions until after the fact. Yeah, I want to see him. I think it's a good idea, Dan. Honest? Always. For self preservation, James didn't mention the fact that Regulus was probably his current neighbor who clearly didn't like him very much. He sort of wished he had left a better first impression, if he was Sirius's brother and everything. Too late now, he supposed a second impression would have to do. Hours later, after James had slept more and Sirius had come back from visiting his brother, James realized his second chance was going to be a lot sooner than he had expected. We're going to the ballet, Sirius said excitedly. They had all found their way to his hotel room because he told them he had very important news to share. They had to drag Remus out of bed actually, since he simply was refusing to get up. Normally, they all knew better than to mess with Remus while he was sleeping. But this was about Sirius, so he could get over it. Remus practically lit up anyway, but it was cute how he had tried to hide it. He was probably glad that James pulled him off of the bed now. Oh, the ballet, he asked in an attempt to be casual. He started twisting his fingers, though, giving away his secret excitement. Sirius rolled his eyes fondly. Yes, Mooney, the ballet. My brother invited us. Your brother? Peter asked, eyes almost dropping out of their sockets. James tried to subtly shake his head to not make a big deal of it, but it was too late. Well, he couldn't say he didn't try. Yes, my brother, Sirius said sharply. From his tone, it was clear that it was all he was willing to say on the subject. So, what's the dress code for this? James asked in his best attempt to drive the conversation to something else. It worked, because if there was something that Sirius absolutely loved talking about, it was clothes. Same with Peter. The two of them often tried way too hard on their outfits, and this was no exception. The dress code, apparently, was suits. None of them had brought suits with them on their tour. They hadn't even thought about it. Why would they? They weren't exactly the most comfortable fashion statement they could make on stage. Sirius offered to buy all of them one, using his inherited fortune to pay for it. James himself had a bit of money saved up, plus, as more time passed, they made more money from their music. So, between the two of them, they fronted the cost of the suits without much trouble. After this tour, they were going to be rich anyway. It was going to make them a household name. Sirius helped Remus do up his tie, although James was quite sure he knew how to do it himself, so it was amusing to watch him ask Sirius for help. Sometimes it was hard to tell whether they were actually flirting or it was just the way their personality clashed. Either way, Sirius would never do anything with Remus. He thought it would jeopardize the integrity of the band, and there wasn't much that Sirius cared more about than the band. It was his baby, essentially. Excited, Mooney, Peter teased, doing up his own tie by himself. If Wormtail could tie a tie, then so could Remus. James was almost certain of it. Remus pretended like he had no idea what Peter was referring to, feigning nonchalance. But even Sirius had taken to teasing him over it. Oh, Mooney absolutely loves ballets, he said like he was sure. Pretty sure Tchaikovsky makes him horny. I hate all of you, Remus said after they all laughed. No, really, you need to find a new bass player. James smiled wider, knowing that Remus would never even think about leaving them again. But who are all the women going to absolutely fawn over? They do not fawn over. Remus cut himself off when he saw the way James was grinning like he was absolutely mad. Truthfully, he probably was, but he had only said it to get a reaction out of Sirius, and it had worked. He was hell-bent on proving his theories correct. The score was 1-0, and he was winning. 2-0 if he counted the tie incident. The ballet was fancy. They arrived in a car that Sirius's brother sent for them, and they were dropped off right at the front door. There were a couple of people taking pictures of people as they walked up, something that none of them really prepared for but knew how to handle. Holy shit, Peter said, looking out the car window in awe. The building was lit up in the yellows and whites, showcasing the ballet. It was opening weekend for Swan Lake, and it was crowded. Women were wearing floor length gowns and heels. Men were wearing freshly tailored suits, and everybody just screamed elegance. It was such a stark contrast to their show. It was sweaty and dirty and chaotic. It was rock and roll. The seats they had were really good. There was a perfect view of the entire stage, and Sirius told them he was sure Regulus had gotten them literally the best seats in the house on purpose. He's so fucking pretentious, Sirius mumbled. James was excited though. He didn't entirely know why, seeing as he knew almost nothing about the ballet, but everyone there was dressed to the aces, ready for a show. So, what's gonna happen? Peter asked, just as confused as James was. He shrugged. I suppose they dance? They tell a story, Remus interjected. And then he looked away, like he hadn't been the one to say that. Sirius looked incredibly fond, probably glad that somebody else in their band was enjoying the fine arts. Moon is right. This one's Swan Lake, Sirius told them. Of course, James had heard of Swan Lake. Everyone had heard of it. He just, well, he didn't entirely know what it meant. Rothbard cast a spell on Odette and turns her into a swan. Why? Peter interjected. Because Wormtail. He's evil, and it's a story. Siegfried falls in love with Swan Queen Odette, who, because of the curse, is only a human at night. Remus stopped Sirius from explaining there, saying it wasn't kind to spoil the story for Peter and James, who were going to apparently love the ending. James wasn't sure how he was supposed to get much of a story from just some people dancing ballet, but Remus was very insistent that they, quote, shut their mouths because it was about to begin. James noticed him right away. He was drawn to him. He couldn't help it. Regulus was smacked up in the middle of the stage, holding a very pretty girl in very low dip. James had been right. Regulus was the person who had come to his door and asked him to turn down the music, and this explained the bloodied and bruised feet. Even still, James thought he was flawless. He didn't need to know anything about the ballet to be able to tell that Regulus was a fantastic dancer. James got a bit sad every time Regulus left the stage, and his heart picked up a little bit each time he came back. He was like one of Pavlov's dogs, waiting for a little treat and reacting the moment he got it. The bell went off, and he was waiting for his reward each and every time. Sirius looked proud of what his brother had achieved, at what he was doing. One of the stars in the most popular ballets in one of the biggest performing centers in all of the world? Remus was giddy, his eyes darting all over, trying to take everything in as quickly as he could. He tended not to show when he was excited about most things, but there was no hiding it. Peter mostly looked confused, but he had a sort of dazed smile on his face and he watched the ballet dancer spin and leap. He didn't know what was going on, but it was fantastic to watch. He kept looking back down at the program, trying to figure out which part they were at and what was going on, but that only seemed to make him more confused. Everything had felt so real that when Regulus went down, at first it had seemed like part of the dance. The other person on stage with him didn't react immediately, still dancing. But once she noticed, everything paused. Everyone paused as Regulus laid on the ground, completely unconscious, with his wrist twisted in an uncomfortable position. James has never seen Sirius move so fast.